Hey guys, so today we're talking about the 1970s, and this is a decade wrought with hippies and counterculture, as well as issues with the Soviet Union. The Cold War is still going on. Vietnam ends during this time period. We will have a few presidents, including Nixon. We'll have Ford, and we'll have Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer, one of my favorites. Okay, so let's get going. Nixon, what we know about him thus far is that he expanded the war in Vietnam after he said he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam by bombing in Cambodia and Laos and sending more troops while in the midst of saying we're going to send more supplies and train the South Vietnamese. That was his policy of Vietnamization. Didn't really pan out that way. Let's see what Nixon is doing outside of Vietnam when it comes to foreign policy. So during this time period, we're going to have a shift of U.S. policy towards communism. Before it was the policy of containment, and containment meaning stopping the spread of communism. Détente is going to be a different type of policy, and it just means the easing of tensions. So Secretary of State Henry Kissinger at this time, he will really head this up, and the idea behind all of this easing of tensions is the idea of realpolitik, 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 and that's the idea that nations should pursue policies that are in their best interests and not worry about a worldview or what other nations should be doing. And so, in a sense, it's like if we have strong nations, they balance out each other. And that is essentially what Nixon says during this time period. Let me read you a quote. He calls it the balance of power. It will be a safer world and a better world if we have a strong, healthy United States, Europe, Soviet Union, China, and Japan, each balancing each other out. Nixon said that in 1971. And so Henry Kissinger will go to China and the Soviet Union and say, hey, we want to ease tensions with you. Would it be okay if we had met and had a peace meeting? You, me, and Richard Nixon. And of course, as we know from our reading, that Nixon will end up visiting China and the USSR. So let's learn about that. First place he visits in 1972, and this is very historic, that we have a president traveling to Asia, and especially China. If you remember, China turned to communism in the 1949 revolution, where Mao Zedong came to power. Mao Zedong, not a great leader, but pretty effective in keeping his rule over China, and there he is in the corner right there. So, in the Chinese Revolution of 1949, remember, a group of Chinese moved to Taiwan, and they themselves called Taiwan the People's Republic of China, while the communist China under Mao Zedong is saying, no, we are China, and the U.S. had recognized those fleeing communism under the policy of containment. Richard Nixon, under the policy of détente, will ease those tensions and will be the first president to recognize communist China as China. And now he kind of set it up in this weird situation where the United States to this day recognizes Taiwan as China and China as China. So kind of a sticky situation right there for the United States. During this time period, the Soviet Union will express desire to ease tensions with us as well, but one of the first things they do is not so great setup for that. In Czechoslovakia, and at this point it is Czechoslovakia, it is not Slovakia and the Czech Republic as it is today, as one nation, there's a protest against the Soviet sphere of influence, and it is a student-led protest that the Soviet Union comes in and steamrolls over them and squashes them, and the U.S. is so preoccupied with fighting in Vietnam that they don't even get involved in Czechoslovakia, as it is crying out, dying for help for us. So Nixon essentially kind of ignores that situation and still visits the capital of Russia. And when the new leader, Brezhnev, which I didn't include a picture, I'll have to show you guys in class, when the new leader comes to power after Khrushchev, he will say, Nixon, let's ease tensions, let's talk about reducing nuclear missiles. So Nixon goes to the USSR, meets with Brezhnev, and they come up with the SALT I treaty. And there will be a SALT II, we'll talk about that later. The SALT I is Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And essentially it is, we're going to stop making this type of missile, this nuclear missile. We're going to reduce our amount to just 200 per country, which is great. It's good that we have gotten to this point of easing tensions, that we're talking about getting rid of nuclear power and nuclear arms buildup. here's the issue that then they didn't know, but now we know. Secretly, both nations were still continuing to build up nuclear power, but not missiles, so they got around the treaty. Instead, they'll start building up nuclear warheads, and I think I have a statistic here for you. So by the 1990s, 2 decades after this, each country, the US and the Soviet Union, will have over 20,000 nuclear warheads in their country. So yes, SALT 1 is great, but was it effective at nuclear arms reduction? No, just effective at nuclear missile reduction. One kind of weird foreign policy thing, we're going to see the rise of issues in the Middle East during this time period, especially because in 1949, or 1948, Israel was declared as a nation state for the Jewish people. And America backed that decision, and even into our current administration with President Trump, he has backed that decision to recognize Israel as its own country. Now, when Israel came in 1948-49, Arabs, Palestinian, did not agree with that because their land was being taken, and those tensions are still around today as we see issues in the Middle East. During this time period, they will embargo oil to the United States, and here's why. There is a war called the Yom Kippur War, and it was waged by the Arabs and the Palestinians on one of the Jewish holy holidays, Yom Kippur. And essentially, it was just the rise of the tensions to the point that they couldn't take it anymore, and they attacked Israel, which was expanding during this time period. And so when the United States and other friendly nations that, like Great Britain and France that we're friends with, support Israel, then the Arab states will embargo oil to us, and that's an issue because we use that oil to power our factories, to power our cars, to essentially power our homes, our whole nation. The oil embargo will be eased and negotiated by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, but it's about to get worse. In 1972, I believe, I'm sorry, I lied, 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, this is Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and Venezuela, places where lots and lots and lots of oil is, they will form OPEC, the organization, I've already said that, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And this organization will come together because a lot of those are Arab states in that area with Israel, and raise the price of oil from $3 to $11.95 per barrel. So I just rounded up to 12 for your notes. And essentially the message they're sending is support the Arab nations and not Israel, or we won't sell you oil. And that's a very effective strategy for them to take because the United States is very dependent, even dependent to this day, on oil from the Middle East and Venezuela. So in the U.S., gas prices double, inflation goes up because the price of gas and oil and the things that we use to power affects absolutely everything. And there's an oil shortage. Now, Nixon won't ration oil, but later on we're going to see presidencies. While this is still happening, the oil shortage and the gas prices doubling happens for a very, very long time. It's going to get to a point where Americans have to ration their gas use. So if your license plate ends on an odd number, then you get gasoline on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. If your license plate ends on an even number, then you get it Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. It's closed on Sunday, can't buy gas. That sort of situation is going to be reality for Americans living in the 70s and 80s. All right, next picture. Love this. This is Nixon's signature pose, and he is harking back to Winston Churchill's 1945 campaign, V for Victory. But what is most famous about this picture is not him saying victory in Vietnam. It's actually, this is the exact pose he takes as he's leaving the White House, and they take a picture of him after Watergate when he resigns. He's like, yeah, like great remorse there, Richard. So let's talk about what he does at home. This is leading up to Watergate stuff. I know that's what you all really want to know. During this time period, Richard Nixon is going to pass a few things that have to do with the environment, a few things that have to do with government regulation of businesses, and with welfare, helping poor families. One of the first is revenue sharing, and this is, I believe, $10 billion. Let me find it in my notes really quick. Oh, I lied. $30 billion over 5 years in 1972 to share with the states. And along with this bill, it wasn't passed in the bill, but it was insinuated that the states would use that to help low-income families and establish a minimum wage for those considered low income. But that wasn't put in the bill, just kind of like Nixon nudging them saying, hey, you should do it this way. One organization put up during this time period is OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And OSHA, as we know it today, is a government organization that regulates businesses and makes sure that it's safe where you work. Now, I know you're thinking like factories and people's hands getting cut off and stuff, but let me give you a modern day example of OSHA. My dad works for Louisville Metro Police Department. And on his floor, the floor above was where overflow prisoners were held. Well, the prisoners in protest backed up the toilets, and like poop and sewage was coming down through the ceilings of where my father worked. And even though they cleaned it all up, OSHA said, nope, that's very, very dangerous. You can't be around other people's bodily fluids and sewage. And so that floor is condemned, and no one can work on that floor or be on that floor. That's just an example of something that OSHA does in modern times. Also during this time period, we're going to have the enactment of environmental legislation. In 1970 will be the first Earth Day, April 22nd, and that just kind of kicks off what's kind of been coming up, people caring a lot about the environment. Also a book called Silent Spring that exposed the poisonous effects of pesticides. Yeah, you think you're eating healthy, but look at the stuff that we use to treat our food. Nixon, not a fan of all this environment stuff, but he goes along with it. He will actually sign into law the Environmental Protection Agency, and if you've ever seen the Simpsons movie, this is what the grandpa has a premonition about in church. And he's like, Eepa, Eepa, and he has a seizure and falls down, and they roll him up in the carpet. And it's all about Homer Simpson dumping pig poop into a lake. Anyway, go watch the Simpsons movie. It's great. It has nothing to do with U.S. history. But EPA at the time is made to reduce automobile and factory emissions, clean up pollution, and it's not to stop the issues of environment legislation. It's just to kind of like put a band-aid on it. Also passed during this time, Endangered Species Act makes the bald eagle an endangered species, so yay. One thing I want to talk about that is not really, really quickly because I'm running out of time, but is not actually on your notes, just want you to know about it. In 1979, there was something called a 3 Mile incident, and this has to do with the environment as well. It was a nuclear power plant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and at this plant, a nuclear reactor overreacted, I guess, got a little bit angry, and the core that's producing the energy in the nuclear reactor started leaking, and just not a visible leak, and so it got into the steam, which then turned into condensation when it gets cold. That gets into the water, groundwater, so people are afraid during this time period, if they live in this area, that their water that could possibly be infected by 3 Mile Island had radioactivity in it. So 100,000 citizens of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania are evacuated. The reactor is shut down for 6 years. A lot of the power in the area doesn't work because it was fueled by the nuclear reactor. And this isn't an issue, like it's not going to be on your AP test, but it just shows you the issue of environmentalism during the 1970s. It's a huge deal. A bunch of people protest against nuclear weapons as well as nuclear reactors as a way to power our country, as that it's not clean energy. And clean energy is still a fight that we fight today, whether or not to use coal. For example, in Eastern Kentucky, that's a huge, huge issue because coal fuels their economy, but it's also very bad for the environment. And instead moving to things like wind power. If you've ever driven to Chicago up through Indiana, you see miles and miles and miles of windmills. So environmentalism is an issue that really comes to a head in the 70s and is still an issue today. All right, so at home, one of the issues that Nixon is facing is the rise of inflation. During this time period, inflation will reach 12%, meaning goods are 12% more than they would usually be, and the value of the dollar has depreciated. So 12% less on your dollar, 12% more goods. And from 1969 to 1981, the cost of living, that's COL, has tripled, which is a lot of money. So you always think your grandparents say, well, I bought a piece of gum for a nickel, or I bought burger and Coke for $1. Well, you can tell them now, well, guess what, Grandpa? In the 70s, the cost of living tripled. Can't afford that anymore. Need more money. Help me out. Nixon will attempt to put price and wage controls. So Congress gives him power to freeze prices and wages. So for 90 days, that's all he can do legally, is freeze the price of things. After that 90 days, it's kind of more of a voluntary thing. Will you please do this so that inflation doesn't rise? Of course, that doesn't help. So Nixon will cut back spending, and he'll do something called impounding, where the funds, when the Congress makes their budget, you're supposed to carry out that budget. Well, Congress made the budget, and he kept some of those funds in order to try and stop the increase of inflation by not putting that much money out there. This is called impounding and is not the right thing to do, but we'll see other presidents kind of get in trouble for the same thing that is. During this time period, we have what is called stagflation, and stagflation means that people are not making stuff and not buying stuff, but inflation is still happening. So the value of the dollar is going down and things are getting more expensive. This is a rare type of inflation because typically when things are inflated, it means that the price has gone up. There might be a surplus. No, there's less productivity, less GDP, but still we have inflation rising. You're going to learn all about that next year in Mr. Sayers' government and econ class. Sorry, just econ. So inflation is at 11 to 12% at this time, but so is unemployment. How does that happen? If we aren't making goods, people lose jobs, and yet the price of things is still going up. So if you see, let me move myself real quick. Yep, a stagflation scenario where GDP is down, and if GDP is down, not a lot of stuff is being made, which means people have lost their jobs, unemployment is up. But since there's inflation, the value of dollar is less, if your pay does not rise, then you are not making enough to keep up with the inflation. So actually earnings are down if you calculate the inflation in and out of it. And of course, inflation is up, okay? All right, let's get to the most fun part. Watergate. We all know that's what Nixon is famous for. I love this little cartoon ad on the right. I'm not really sure the source of it. The Puzzle of Watergate, a jigsaw puzzle that will bug you. So an actual puzzle, but you see the little bugs crawling into the White House. Obviously, we're talking about bugging the Democratic National Convention at Nixon's hand here. So let's find out what happened. Watergate. In the election of 1972, Nixon will win the election. So he's elected to his second term. But essentially, Nixon surrounds himself with people that like him. As we all tend to do, right? And that won't call him out on his crap. So during this time period, he will gather his cabinet, I guess you could call him his cabinet, and ask them to come up with the list of people that he feels threatened by, that he feels like he couldn't win the election because of. So go back. This is before the election. We know he's going to win, but this is what he's planning to do in order to win. He asks then the FBI to take that list and spy on them, bug their houses, bug their telephones, find out what they are saying about Nixon and how he can stop them. He also asks, which I believe is very interesting, the IRS to audit the crap out of them, which is so annoying. And also, Nixon's a smart man. He knows that if he finds something like tax evasion or a tax issue, much easier to bring down someone with that sort of cry against them. Here's a little cartoon of Nixon, and we all know that he is posing here as Pinocchio, and when Pinocchio tells a lie, his nose grows. So here is Nixon, and his nose is labeled Watergate. Here we go. The committee to re-elect the president, unfortunately, acronymed with the acronym CREEP. And if you've ever seen The Lonely Island, the CREEP, that's what's in the top right corner. Essentially, they start this huge campaign to illegally fund Nixon's campaign. So you guys that took government last year, you know there are very strict rules for who the Democratic, well, who any candidate can take money from to help their campaign. You know, there's PACs and super PACs, and it's a very confusing process. Well, CREEP was not doing it legally, and essentially that money was put into Nixon's campaign, but also on the side put into spying on the Democrats. And we know that this will happen at the Watergate Hotel. We're getting there. Essentially, Nixon is really, really afraid of people distrusting the government at this time. He sees it. He knows it's happening. And when the Pentagon Papers come out towards the beginning of his second term, towards the end of his second term, first term, towards the end of his first term, when the Pentagon Papers come out, and remember they were leaked by an ex-defense analyst, an ex-government worker, and they told the whole story of the Vietnam War and how the government had lied. Nixon is super, super fearful of that happening to him and all of this getting out. And of course, he will do whatever it takes to make sure that that does not happen. So here's the down and dirty of the Watergate scandal. This is summer of 1972. The election's going to happen that November. Bottom right corner there, you see the Watergate Hotel. This is in Washington, D.C., and we all know that Forrest Gump stayed there during the Watergate scandal. Am I right? If you haven't seen Forrest Gump, you need to see it. So these burglars are hired by Creep. So essentially, hiring people to go into the Democratic National Headquarters, bug the place, look for secret documents, and bring them back to who they were hired by, Creep. And then Creep would then tell Nixon what was going on. Nixon, of course, will deny this involvement. He'll deny any ties to the break-in, and he'll do this huge cover-up. But when the Senate starts bringing in people to hear them, essentially on a trial, we will see more and more of this cover-up come to light by people who, I guess, can't keep their mouths shut, but shouldn't have been involved anyway. One issue of the Watergate scandal that is very interesting and people find interesting is that Nixon taped all of his conversations in the White House. Now, this is not super uncommon. FDR did something like this, and later on presidents will do the same. So essentially conversations in the Oval Office are not secret, but the president can choose to keep those secret. Well, the Senate, in some of their hearings, find out about these tapes, and Nixon then fires the people that told him. Kind of interesting. And he is ordered to give the tapes to the Senate. He refuses, and they say, no, you have to give the tapes to us, or you will be kicked out of office. So he gives up the tapes, but there are 18 minutes that have been cut out, like literal tapes, you know, and then spliced together, if you know how that works. And the case then, once they realize that Nixon is doing this whole cover-up issue, now think again, this is over like a 2-year period they are investigating this, then it is taken to the Supreme Court. During this time, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, he has resigned on tax evasion charges, and among other scandal-like issues that don't really have to do with Watergate, but it makes you look pretty bad if your vice president resigns right at the time you're getting in trouble. It makes it look like he might have gotten in trouble too. And during this time, Gerald Ford is appointed to the vice presidency. So Gerald Ford was not elected to the vice presidency. He was actually the House Minority Leader and didn't think he was going to be the president. Didn't think he was going to be the vice president. He was on a short list of people that could have been appointed, and then he was approved by the Senate to be the vice president. This will become an issue later when Gerald Ford will become our only president who wasn't elected. So technically, when you vote for a president, you're also voting for their vice president. If you voted for Donald Trump in this last election, you're also casting your vote for Mike Pence. So when people voted for Nixon, they were casting their vote for Spiro Agnew. Well, Spiro Agnew resigns, and then Nixon will be close to impeached and resign as well, and Gerald Ford will become president. Well, he was never elected. It's kind of like this constitutional issue, and one of the first things Gerald Ford will say, spoiler alert, is our Constitution works. Like, I know I wasn't elected, but I'm still a government official. So, kind of interesting, never elected on a presidential ticket, but still one of our presidents. Love this cartoon right here. One of Nixon's most famous quotes is, "I am not a crook," and here he is removing 18 minutes of the Watergate. Of course, Nixon will be will be, what's the word? Oh my gosh. Found guilty of these issues, and for 3 counts he will be impeached. One of the counts is that he tried to cover up the scandal to begin with. He was obstructing justice by trying to cover up the role of the White House in the burglary, okay? The next count was that he violated the rights of U.S. citizens by using the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the CIA, and the IRS to harass people that didn't like him. So that is covering up other people's freedom of speech by using government organizations, or not freedom of speech, but civil liberties by using organizations to do something unlawful. And finally, the last count, defying congressional authority by refusing to turn over the tapes. He said no, they took it to Supreme Court, he had to do it anyway, but with the 18 minutes cut out because he's sneaky. So on August 7th, 1974, in the midst of this, Richard Nixon will resign instead of being removed. So we have never had a president that has been impeached and removed, just impeached, and then they resign, or he resigned. Gerald Ford will be sworn in, and because of the whole constitutional issue that I just said with Gerald Ford not being actually on a presidential ticket, we will get the 25th Amendment passed through Congress pretty quickly, and this sets presidential succession. And I know that you know that next is the vice president, and then the, oh gosh, I'm losing it really quick, guys. Sorry, guys. Totally blank, got tongue-tied there. Of course, presidential succession, as you know, is president if he dies, vice president if he dies, Speaker of the House if he dies, president of the Senate if he dies, and then it goes cycles through the president's cabinet, like Secretary of Defense, you know, all that. So our first president, our first president to be impeached and resign, Richard Nixon, will be replaced by Gerald Ford, our unelected president, as we talked about earlier. One of the most controversial things that Gerald Ford will do, and some people point to that being the reason he never gets elected again, is the first day of his presidency, he pardons Richard Nixon. As you can see, front page of the Washington Post, in this time period, Ford grants Nixon full pardon, says he has suffered enough. And people have asked Ford, why would you do that? People are angry at him. And I'm so sorry, guys. Ford said, yes, but our great national tragedy needs to be over. We need to move on. He said it was a nightmare. And privately, he told his family that he wanted it to be his presidency. He didn't want it to all be about Nixon before. Funny thing about Ford, he was thinking about getting out of politics before this time period. Boom, becomes vice president. Boom, becomes president. And not a great start to his presidency if a bunch of people are angry at him for pardoning what they see as their national enemy, Richard Nixon. So very quickly, in response to Nixon and everything that happened during his presidency, we'll get a lot of legislation that is kind of backhanded. The War Powers Act was in response more to Lyndon B. Johnson and Nixon for expanding the Vietnam War without congressional approval, which they were given the right to with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that was remanded in 1972 after the Pentagon Papers. But the War Powers Act just sets the limit that we know today that the commander-in-chief, the president, has to send troops to foreign aid or a foreign land to only 60 days with a 30-day withdrawal period. So about 90 days before they can send troops without congressional approval. And that is still in power today. We also have the Impoundment Control Act. Remember, I told you impounding is when the executive branch does not carry out the funding that was put in the budget and instead keeps it. And I don't want to say that in a mean way, keeps it. Richard Nixon did not mean to keep the money. He just didn't want to increase inflation. It puts more regulations on that, makes it illegal like it already was. Next is the Federal Election Campaign Act. Remember, the committee to reelect the president, CREEP, was put in place to raise illegal funds. And the Privacy Act, which is just more regulation on allowing citizens to have prompt access to files that the government has gathered on. All right, so after those bills that are in a reaction to Nixon, Gerald Ford doesn't have a lot of time to do things during his presidency. Little does he know, he will not be reelected in 1976. So it is a very short period in which he is president, about 3 years. Not as short as William Henry Harrison, but that's okay. So under Ford, we'll see the continuation of stagflation, and stagflation is when productivity is down but inflation is up. Kind of doesn't make sense economically, but it is a terrible, terrible equation for the economy. So the economy is just plagued by this issue. Ford will fight against it, and his whole campaign is whip inflation now, WIN, whip inflation now. And actually, he's encouraging voluntary price freezes and inflation freezes. So businesses not raising prices, landlords not raising rent, things like that. If you can, try and help out the economy that way. And while inflation does drop from 12 to 5%, it's just a temporary thing. It's not a real fix to the issue. Voluntary inflation regulation is not going to fix the issue long term. And stagflation and inflation issues will continue throughout Carter and Reagan's presidency. In an attempt to stimulate business, he will cut taxes for the middle class and upper classes. Again, temporary fix, not forever. In his short presidency, he will veto over 50 bills, which is quite hilarious to me. Also, during his presidency is the Helsinki Conference, and this is in 1975. A bunch of countries present, and they essentially officially define some USSR borders, and in response to that, the USSR will promise to guarantee more freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of just civil liberties within their countries, their sphere of influence, and more open communication between the East and the West, like past that Iron Curtain sort of idea, and ensuring basic human rights. They renege on this promise. They don't actually do it, but the U.S. will respond in a way of, oh, look, we did it, we eased some tensions, while underneath, while détente's still going on, like the U.S.-USSR negotiations are falling through and tensions are rising. Again, détente is not working. As we learned at the end of our Vietnam War lecture, the fall of Saigon happens under Ford, and this is when the northern communists in Vietnam will invade the South after the U.S. has left in 1973, and that's in 1975, and the whole country falls to communism and is unified as one Vietnam. And this kind of hurts the American psyche in that it's just it's the bow on top of the present that says Vietnam was pointless. We didn't really win anything there. There was no point in being there. It was just going to end up this way anyway. So flash forward in 1976, we have for the Republicans, Gerald Ford will run again. And against him is that the Soviets are still dominating Eastern Europe. The Helsinki Conference didn't really do much to ensure that those Soviet sphere of influence had those civil rights and civil liberties and basic human rights, essentially, to have a government that they actually believe in. And another knock against him is that on the first day of his presidency, he pardoned Nixon. And people are still mad about that Nixon was not punished as a criminal as they saw him. On the other end, for the Democrats, we have Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer. He's the former governor of Georgia. He was not really involved in Washington politics, not tainted by the politics of Washington, D.C. And thus he's seen as an outsider. He's known for his integrity and his Christian faith. He was a born-again Christian, a Baptist, and he promised, I'll never lie to you. And actually, as a Democrat, he's pretty conservative. What I love most about him is how much he loves his wife. Look it up. So there he is, in his winning smile and beautiful blue eyes. Love Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer. So domestically, let's talk about Carter's domestic policy. So sliding into the presidency hot, Jimmy Carter starts on his first day by granting amnesty to those that had dodged the draft, including those who had burned draft cards, given them back in the national draft return, or fled to Canada. So essentially this is him saying the Vietnam War is over. Let's put it behind us. You will not be fined. You will not be put in prison. You no longer have to hide for dodging the draft. So a very good thing that he does. He also sets up the Department of Education and the Department of Energy. So the Department of Energy was set up in light of the recent gas problem with the Arab oil embargo and OPEC rising the price of the barrel of oil up to about $12. And so even though he creates the Department of Energy and he tries to put taxing inefficient cars and fuel and inefficient factories more to make up for that oil crisis and issue of paying for oil, that doesn't all get passed through Congress. It's kind of a more liberal reform for such a conservative Democrat, and the fuel shortage continues like I talked about earlier. Also during this time period, the economy is just still plagued by stagflation. Carter will attempt and succeed an $18 billion tax cut. Again, just like Ford did to try and stimulate the economy, it's temporary fix. It's a bandage on top of a big wound that won't be healed until the 1990s in a rather large economic boom. During Carter's presidency, he will also fund the Superfund, the Environmental Superfund, and this is just money for the government to spend just on the environment, cleanup of chemical waste dumps, controlling of mining and inefficient mining, as well as protecting tons of acres of forests in like South Dakota and Alaska and places with lots of beautiful trees still standing. Also during this time period, Carter will start a peacetime draft, which is what you guys have to do, men, when you turn 18. You're not going to be drafted unless there's a dire need because our military is currently ready for anything like that. But when males turn 18, if they're 18 to 26, they have to register for the draft. Let's talk about foreign policy during this time period. Carter wants to be a humanitarian. He's a good guy. He's a nice person who really cares deeply about those that are hurting, especially in the term third world countries. But he's not that great at it. He's criticized for how inconsistent he is when dealing with these issues, and also criticized for, well, why would you care to give foreign aid if you won't even help the people suffering from stagflation and economic issues in America? So that's the criticism against him. Foreign policy-wise, he will attempt he won't attempt. He will succeed in transferring ownership of the Panama Canal. Remember, we got the Panama Canal during that imperialism period of like 1890 into like the 1910s, 1920s. So this will allow for the Panama Canal to be transferred within a few years in 1999 and guaranteeing its neutrality. So even though it's not owned by America, America will still be allowed to come through it and ship their goods through it. Probably the most famous thing of Carter's presidency, though, is, well, probably one of the two most famous things is the Camp David Accords. And this is where the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, and the prime minister of Israel will come together for 13 days at Camp David. It's a presidential retreat for all presidents. And over those 13 days, President Carter will have them agree to some sort of peace on their land issues, which is an issue for Arabs and Palestinians and those in Egypt, that Israel got that land in the Middle East. And so this is just setting them on the right path for peace. Unfortunately, the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, will be assassinated. And so while the peace is established, once he is gone, it's going to kind of fall apart again. The Cold War also continues during President Carter's. Oh man, look at those eyebrows. Isn't that the best? So SALT II is going to be a nuclear arms reduction talk between Jimmy Carter there on the left and Brezhnev there on the right with the fantastic eyebrows. And it will be passed by the USSR and signed into law there, but because it's not eventually passed in the US, it's not really a thing. It just shows that we're working with the Soviet Union. So SALT II is, because SALT I was due to expire in 1977, it was a short-term treaty. They want to put forth another one with real nuclear reductions, not one with like a little loophole where we can do nuclear warheads as well. But during this time, the USSR invades Afghanistan, and they invade Afghanistan while these talks were on the table in the Senate. And so the Senate's like, nope, we're not doing SALT II anymore. Look what they're doing, especially because we are interested in the oil in the Middle East, including in Afghanistan. So Carter proclaimed that the U.S. would use any means necessary, including force, to get them out of Afghanistan. So essentially we'll use economic sanctions, including grain embargo and certain technology, not oil, advanced technology, business sort of embargo things. We'll also boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics that were being held in Russia. One of my favorite subjects to talk about, I could talk about it all day because I wrote a huge freaking paper on it in college was the Iranian hostage crisis that happened during Carter's presidency, and this will essentially bring Carter down, and he won't be president again because of this. So in Iran, there's a revolution, and the leader, Reza Shah Pahlavi, he will flee to the United States with medical issues once this Islamic revolution starts. And the leader of the revolution is Khomeini, and he is attempting to turn Iran into a huge Islamic state. So Carter allows the Shah, Reza Shah Pahlavi, into America. And when that happens, there's this huge student protest, and a bunch of Iranians take the U.S. embassy and take hostage those in the embassy. Now, African Americans and women were let go, but a lot of men, American men working in the embassy, were taken hostage. The negotiations are terrible. It doesn't work well. He puts forth a plan, Operation Desert Shah, Desert something like that, where he tries to get back the hostages, and it fails miserably. The helicopter crashes, men die. Khomeini essentially says, don't try that again. And so Carter, during his campaign for the presidency of 1980, is attempting to negotiate these. If he gets these hostages held in Iran free, he's going to win, but he doesn't in time. So for 444 days, the hostages are kept in the embassy in Iran. They are kept safe, but it's still a terrible, terrible foreign policy crisis for Jimmy Carter, and people see him as weak because he can't get these Americans out of the clutches of the Islamic State in Iran. So actually, what happens is the moment that Reagan becomes presidency in 1980, in his inauguration, the hostages are freed as he is giving his acceptance speech at his inauguration, which is absolutely crazy. And some people think that there was a backdoor deal between Reagan and Iran for, the Islamic State under Khomeini in Iran for the hostages to be set free under Reagan. Now, there's no historical documentation as to that, but it's kind of sketchy when the hostages are freed the moment that Reagan becomes president. And here is a front page news from the New York Times from that time period. Reagan takes oath as 40th president, promises an era of national renewal. Minutes later, 52 U.S. hostages in Iran fly to freedom after 444 days of this ordeal being in the hands of the hostage crisis. Now, things that I wish I could have talked about in the 70s, the music. Man, Fleetwood Mac during this time period, and the end of the Beatles, so sad, but unfortunately we don't have time for all that fun cultural stuff in the 1970s. And overall, what I need you to know about this time period is the issue with the USSR getting worse and worse, issues rising in the Middle East, and we will have Middle East problems from this time period, the 1970s, all the way up until recent times. Think the bombing of Syria the other day. So just keep in mind that these issues of the 70s were creeping closer and closer and closer to modern times. So the 70s, 80s, and 90s is laying the groundwork for what we're living through right now.